Hi, it's Pastor Martin here. I'm a little late today, but I want to talk to you today about one of the most crucial and it's fundamental, but often ignored, taken for granted subjects, and that is the subject of forgiveness. Forgiveness. And a human being cannot thrive until they experience God's forgiveness. And the reason why I said we can't thrive is until there is some part in every person that knows deep down, I haven't been the mother, the brother, the son, the father, the friend that I ought to have been, let alone God. And as long as we have that knowledge of ourselves, we don't feel good about ourselves. We can't be truly proud of ourselves. We can't like ourselves. It's only when the shame and the guilt associated with all that we have failed to do is dealt with, that we can come into that broad, free place. And once you're forgiven, it's like shackles fall off. You know, shackles of shame, shackles. When someone's truly been forgiven by God, we're not only reconciled back to God, but we are free from shame and guilt. And you know, everyone has done things that they know is wrong, and they need to get free of shame and guilt, and they need to experience God's forgiveness. And I love Psalm 51 because it's a time where David, who was a godly man, did something. You know, he just stepped over a line that he never thought he'd step over. And sometimes that happens to people. You know, people can actually say, I'd never do that, I'd never do that. I don't think I'm capable of doing X, Y, Z, and then do it. You know, it might be adultery, might be stealing, might be something. And then they do it and they step over that line. And then they discover, you know, their heart, they're not as good as they think they are. But also, having stepped over that line, it creates these feelings of shame and guilt. And guilt and shame can just capture your life. You know, when you've got guilt's actually a good thing because it actually brings conviction. So it tells me that I've done the wrong thing. But shame is something totally different. Shame doesn't tell me I've done the wrong thing. Shame says to me, I'm wrong. I'm all wrong. You know, and God wants his people to be free of that shame and to have that shame totally lifted off our lives. I've met people, you know, that shame has captured their life so much they never attempt to do anything. It's something they did 30 years ago. You know, it may have been, you know, an abortion, a secret abortion they had. Or, you know, they had a secret child and farmed the child, or did something. And they've never, ever forgiven themselves, and they've never, ever got rid of the shame that's associated with it. Now, listen, I want to tell you today how to get rid of shame and guilt, how to be set free from shame and guilt and really experience God's forgiveness. And it's encouraging because whatever you've done, I don't think you've done anything. And the devil wants to tell you you've done the original sin that's unforgivable. It's so bad, nobody else has ever done it. That's how the devil captures people into not confessing their sin. But there's a man in the scriptures called King David. And he was a man who, there were very few like him. He was a great man in God's sight. In fact, Jesus is called the son of David. He came from the line of David. And David was Israel's greatest king. And God paid him the highest compliment by saying he was a man after God's own heart. So that means God just loved his heart. But listen to this. You think you've done something wrong. David, when he was king, he had concubines, wives, could have any woman. But one day, while the army was out fighting and he was back in his palace, he looked out over the rooftops and saw this woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba, and she was somebody else's wife. And David looked over and said, I desire that wife. So cut a long story short, he had her brought to his palace and he slept with her. But after a little while, she came and said, I'm pregnant. So he's looking at a problem. He's got another man's wife pregnant. So what he does, David's a good man, but he panics. He never thought he would have done this, but he panics. Sometimes in panic, we can do things we just normally wouldn't do. So he then panics and summons this woman Bathsheba's husband back from the battle. And to cut a long story short, he arranges his murder. So this man, this man who up until now has had an unblemished record, commits adultery and murder. And he goes on for a number of months, perhaps a year, dealing with this, and really he's got a lot of shame. And God sends his prophet to him, and he tells this story to David. Some of us are familiar with this, but he tells a story about a man who has many sheep and another man who only has one lamb as a pet. And this important traveler comes to town, and the man who has many sheep says, well, we've got to, put on a big dinner for this important guest. But rather than take one of my many sheep, tell the guy over there I want his sheep. And he takes this sheep, this lamb off this guy whose lamb is his pet, and sacrifices that for the feast. And Nathan tells David this story, and David is outraged and says, this is just dreadful, and that man must die. And then the prophet looks at David and said, that man is you. And he's referring to what David did in when he took that man, Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, and had him killed. And when Nathan said that, David experienced this awful conviction. And this is why he was a good king. As the king, he could have killed the prophet, but he didn't. He allowed God to convict him of his sin. And so, but listen, he was convicted of his sin, but God didn't want him to live in that, even though he'd failed and crossed a line. And you may have failed and crossed the line. God doesn't want you to stay there. He loves you and he wants to set you free. And he wants to get you out of that place where you're living with that shame and guilt of what you did many, many years ago. It could be that affair you had. It could be that abortion you had. And that shame is crippling your life. And when David was living with that shame, he wrote this psalm called Psalm 51. And it's all about the prayer he prayed to God relating to his guilt that he was living with. And listen to what he says. He says, have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Now, I just want to point to, he goes on to say down later, he goes on to say, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. And he says, purge me though with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Create in me a clean heart, and renew in me a steadfast spirit. And it says a lot of other wonderful things in this psalm. But it contains the key, and then he says, rejoice to me the joy of your salvation. In verse 14, which is really clear, he says, deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed. So not just deliver me from the bloodshed, but deliver me from the guilt that has crippled me. And the way he was delivered because in Psalm 32, David writes about how he was crippled by his guilt. He said, when I kept silent, my bones grew old. This is what happens when you're guilty. Though my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me, and my vitality turned into the drought of summer. I acknowledge my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hidden from you. He said, yes, I'll confess my transgression to the Lord. Listen to this. And you forgave the guilt of my sin. So basically those two psalms, they speak about how when David did the wrong thing, he was living with this guilt that God actually forgave, not the sin, but the guilt associated with him. And he said in Psalm 51 verse 14, deliver me from the guilt. Now, God did deliver him. God did deliver him. And Psalm 33 justifies and describes how, he was completely set free and washed clean. And that guilt just dropped off his life so he could function. He could be free and his life could thrive again, as though, when God forgives you and washes you clean, as though you never did it. It's not a cop-out, but that's what it feels like. You're free of that guilt. But the way to get free is in Psalm 51. I want to show you how to get free of guilt. If you've done something that is still sticking to you, this is what you've got to do. First of all, you've got to take your guilt to heart. In the original sin in Genesis chapter 1, Eve sins, eats the apple, and then God comes and says, what have you done? And she denies it. She said, I didn't do anything. And she starts to blame her husband. He made me do it. You'll never get free of your guilt if you try to justify why you did it, if you try to, apportion blame, if you try to, be the victim. You've actually got to come to God and say, I did it. And David says, why he did it? He says, I was brought forth in iniquity. In sin, my mother conceived. And what he's saying, I did it because there's something in me that's not right. And what we have a sin nature. And he says, I did it because I am a sinner. That's the problem. That's the problem. I have a sin nature. And he said, but he didn't run from it. He actually owned it. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to be big enough to take your guilt to heart. It's the first step. So you've got to not deny it, take your guilt to heart. Secondly, now, a lot of people will do that. Like you go to AA, they talk about, the problem of denial and taking your guilt to heart. But a lot of people in those programs, they never get free of their guilt because they don't do the second step. What you've got to do, you've got to take it to heart and own your guilt. But secondly, David took it to God. And this is what he said. He said, have mercy upon me, cleanse me from my sin, blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. Verse 7, purge me with hyssop, and I shall be whiter than, I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be white as snow. Blot out all my iniquities and create in me a clean heart, renew a steadfast spirit within me. So what David was basically saying is saying, having taken my sin to heart, I'm now taking it to God and asking him to blot it out. Because your sin your sin makes you feel guilty because it's like God's still looking at it, but God is able to blot it out, to remove it from your life as far as the east is from the west, to wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. So we're not only got to take it to heart, we've got to take it to God and believe that he will wash us clean. And he is able to when we have put our faith in Jesus Christ, because it says the blood of Jesus washes us clean of sin. 1 John 1:7. So we've got to actually not only own our failure and our guilt and what we've done, but we've then got to confess and take to God, say, God, wash it away from me. Just remove it from my life. And you know what? This is what David said. Did God do it for David? Listen to what he wrote later on after he prayed that prayer. And he wrote in Psalm 33, blessed is he whose transgression or guilt is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute sin, in whose spirit there is no deceit. So what he's basically saying is he failed and he did the wrong thing and he couldn't hide from it. When he did hide from it, it says he was groaning all day long. But when he owned it and took it to God, God covered his sin. God covered, he washed it clean, he removed it. So once that happens, once the sin is removed, once the sin is washed clean from you, the guilt which is associated with sin leaves your life. So that's the way you get free. That's the way you experience true forgiveness from God, is that you've got to own your own sin. Don't become a victim. Don't portion blame. You say, I did it. There may have been circumstances. People may have been done wrong things to me. But for my responsibility, I'm going to own what I did. I'm going to take it to heart, but then I'm not going to leave it there. I'm going to take it to God. I'm going to take it to God. And then finally, David says, and restore to me the joy of salvation. That's what God will do for you. You know, when you know you've done the wrong thing and you're carrying that guilt, and then you experience the forgiveness and the shame being taken away, the effect of that is you experience God's joy again. So I pray for people who, you know, have crossed the line that they never thought they'd crossed, somewhere along the line, done something that society may condemn you for. God is a forgiving God, and he doesn't want you to carry that guilt and that shame that can cripple your life. He actually sent Jesus to the cross to really not only forgive you, but wash you clean and make you live freely as though you had never sinned. Amen? I trust this has helped you. And maybe you know someone who is living with guilt. We'll send this to them on social media and be a blessing to them. I'm Pastor Martin, and I will be back tomorrow with my lovely wife to bring another message of hope. And until then, I will say to you, have a wonderful day in Jesus.